I said last week that there are various types of Bible literature. The books of the Bible in the Old Testament is written as historical narrative. Just tells a story about the kings, about the leaders, about the prophets and priests in the Old Testament. There's didactic literature, which is teaching literature, like the book of Ephesians or Colossians, where Paul goes point by point. Acts is part of that narrative literature. It's like sitting around with an old friend and telling a story. And the book of Acts, written by Luke, the Greek physician, is a very detailed account of missionary journeys of the Apostle Peter, of the Apostle Paul. And we're in the last four chapters today of the book of Acts in our adventures in Acts, when we talk about the birth and the growth of the church. Now, I always say the book of Acts continues. It's here on Sunday morning. It's not being in written form, but we are living out the book of Acts. It's technically titled the Acts of the Apostles, but it really talks about the church and how the church grew, and here we are 2,000 years later. Now, it might be amazing to you, because it's kind of amazing to me, that you could take a book like the Bible that spanned 1,600 years, 40 different writers, and they come to the same conclusion that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. He's the answer for the world. He's the answer for Jews and Gentiles alike. He's the Savior of the world. And to have all of that detail agree is an amazing thing. There's no other book on earth that could do that. And the reason is it was planned by God, it was inspired by God, and it's literally the instruction manual for you and I. So when we read the book of Acts or study the book of Acts, there's instruction there. There's learning. There's example there. There are things that the Apostle Paul did, and that's part of how we understand how we should live as Christians. We've looked at a lot of the travels of the Apostle Paul, his first missionary journey in the book of Acts, second missionary journey from Acts 15 to Acts 18. The third missionary journey that he wraps up in Acts chapter 21. And then a series of accusations and trials from 21 to 26. And then there's the wrap up with some shipwrecks and travel to Rome in chapters 27 and 28. So we are in chapters 24, 25, and 26 today. I know it's a lot to tackle, but we'll get through it just like we did last week. And then his journey to Rome, which covers the rest of the book. In Acts chapter 24 and verse 27, we ended last week leaving Paul in custody. Acts 24 and verse 27, it says, when 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. He's the next leader to take over up there in Caesarea. But because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. So for 2 years, Paul was in prison. Nobody addressed this, and then Festus took over. How'd you like to have a politician like that? Maybe some of you do have representatives that are like that. It's a little bit scary. Here's Caesarea on the coast where Herod's fort is, where Paul was being held. You see Herod's palace right here. Most of it's not left because it washed away and has been destroyed. But there's an enormous amphitheater there. There's a hippodrome, another amphitheater over here. And this is the place where Paul would be under guard there in Caesarea. Pick it up in Acts chapter 25 and verse 1. 3 days after arriving in the province, this new leader, Festus, went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. So he goes along the coast, actually literally down south geographically, but up because Jerusalem is set on a hill, where the chief priests and the Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. So here's Festus. He's new in office. Felix had left Paul there for 2 years. Paul was chained to Roman guards and shared the gospel with them. And Festus comes in and he says, I probably ought to do something about this guy Paul. I mean, he's been sitting around for 2 years. He is a Roman citizen. There ought to maybe be some justice here. Although the Romans, yeah, they made those rules, they made those laws, but they didn't really care that much about justice. You could usually bribe your way out of it. In fact, often kings and leaders were just looking for a bribe to get out of jail. So they requested Festus, the Jews did, as a favor to them to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem. So they said, Paul, bring him from Caesarea down the coast, bring him to Jerusalem, because we have a plan. So they're asking Festus to do this. And their plan was this: they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. So when he was in Jerusalem, they had a plot 2 or 3 years earlier to kill him. And they took him off to Caesarea, left him up there. Now they want to bring him back to Jerusalem, which doesn't happen, incidentally. Festus answered, Paul is being held in Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. So let some of your leaders come with me, and if the man has done anything wrong, they can press charges against him there. So this is Luke's story. After spending 8 or 10 days with them, Festus went back down to Caesarea. So he left Jerusalem, went to Caesarea. Now, you got to remember, Festus and the Jews, these Jewish leaders, they were all pretty corrupt and they were all pretty cozy. Now, you don't see that today, obviously, but it was in those days that way. The next day he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. When Paul came in, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him. They brought many serious charges against him, but here's what Luke says: but they could not prove them. Because there were no witnesses. There was no one who said that Paul really did disrupt the temple in Jerusalem, that Paul really did, as he was accused, bring Gentiles into the Jewish part of the temple. He never did that. It was, as we say, fake news, right? Okay, and there was a lot of that going around. So Paul makes his defense before Festus. Paul made his defense: I have done nothing wrong against the Jewish law or against the temple, or even against Caesar as a Roman citizen. Now that would be under penalty of death if you did something wrong against Caesar. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor. There's always that backstory that's going on. He's cozy with the Jewish leaders are cozy with him. You got to remember, Israel was a thorn in the Roman Empire's flesh. They were like an independent state, but they were controlled ultimately by Rome. But they would let the Jews, and they didn't want to mess with religion, so they would kind of let them do their own thing. But they were a nightmare for the Romans. There was always, every once in a while, they'd come in and they'd put down a riot, they'd put down some kind of unrest. And you notice Israel hasn't changed much. It's not Israel's fault, but it hasn't changed much around there. That's God's hot spot for the whole world. And he said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges? Look what Paul says. Paul answered, I am now standing before Caesar's court. This is a Roman court, not a Jewish court, where I ought to be tried. Why? Because I'm a Roman citizen. I have not done any wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But you got to prove it first, because I'm a Roman citizen. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. And he says this statement: I appeal to Caesar. Now that's like a magic phrase. He's a Roman citizen. And you're going to hear this repeated over and over again in this passage. I appeal to Caesar. Takes it out of the hands of the Jews, puts it in the hands of the Romans. And if you appeal to Caesar, you cannot not have your trial if you're a Roman citizen. It had to happen. Now, God had told Paul before, you're headed to Rome. You had all this trouble in Jerusalem, and you're going to go to Rome, and you're going to have trouble too. And so God used this to get him to Rome so that he could be a missionary, basically, in Rome. After Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, you have appealed to Caesar, you will go. And so Festus goes to the next highest level, who is King Agrippa. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice, and they're king of a larger province. They're not like Caesar at this stage, or one of the members of the Caesar family. But a few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice, his wife, arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Because remember, Festus just went into office, so it was kind of a little pomp and circumstance. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. He said, "There is a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned." You see, literally, the Jews could not condemn or even execute. That's why crucifixion was a Roman thing. They would try to stone people. That was the Jewish thing. But basically, they could not have authority to do anything, to execute, to do capital punishment, unless the Romans gave them that permission. I told them, verse 16, that it is not the Roman custom to hand over anybody before they have faced their accusers and have had an opportunity to defend themselves against the charges. Do you know something? Do you know where we get the right to a fair trial in the United States? It comes, yes, somewhat from Roman culture, but largely from biblical culture. It comes from the fact that the founders of our nation read the Bible, understood these customs, and basically wrote them in to our laws. And that's one of the reasons we have the best constitutional republic in the world. There's never, even the Roman government didn't compare with the government that we have that needs to be upheld as our founders put it. When they came here with me, verse 17, I did not delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man to be brought in. When his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. Instead, I love this from Festus. Instead, they had some points of dispute, some minor little points of dispute. They were arguing religion with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus. And he's really tuned in, who Paul claimed was alive. I don't know what this crazy guy Paul is talking about, but this is what he's saying, and this is what Festus is saying to Agrippa. And I was at a loss how to investigate such matters, so I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. But when Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear this man myself. He replied, tomorrow you will hear him. So they convened the court. Paul then stands before Agrippa, and it says, the next day Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience with the room of high-ranking military officers and the prominent men of the city. And at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Festus said, King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. So let's hear this. But I found he had done nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. He appealed to Caesar, he has to go to Rome. But I have nothing definite to write his majesty about him. Now, could you imagine that conundrum? Could you imagine that situation? You send a person to Caesar, the emperor, the highest ranking person, the person who calls himself a god, and you say, I'm sending this guy Paul, but I don't know why. I don't have anything to charge him with. What do you think Caesar's going to do? What do you think Festus would be worried about? Like, lose my head for doing something like this. So he's very wise, and he talks to Agrippa. Therefore, I have brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. For I think it is unreasonable to send a prisoner on to Rome without specifying the charges against him. Not only unreasonable, it's deadly. You wouldn't do that. And he was a smart enough cookie not to do that. Then Agrippa said, Acts 26, verse 1, "You have permission to speak for yourself, Paul." So Paul motioned with his hand and began his defense. Now, he does all the flattery things like King Agrippa, I'm honored to stand here and everything else. And he's done that before everyone because he was a lawyer and he knew what to do. He knew how to deal with these things. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But I want you to see some things. Paul starts to recount his conversion and his experience with the Jews. And in verse 4, he says, the Jewish people all know the way I have lived ever since I was a child. So he goes back, and there's probably 3 or 4 times in the book of Acts where Paul tells this story over and over again. Now I want to ask you a question. What's your story? Have you ever put it together? We used to have people do what we would call a 3-minute testimony. Basically, you would put something together that in a few short minutes you could share about how you experienced Christ, about how you came to Christ, about how you became a Christian. That's all Paul is saying, and it's a good thing for everybody to be able to know how to do. I want to jump down to verse 6. He talks about being a Pharisee. "And now it is because of my hope in what God has promised our ancestors that I am on trial today." What was the promise to the ancestors? To Abraham, Moses, all of them. This is the promise our 12 tribes are hoping to see fulfilled as they earnestly serve God day and night. King Agrippa, it is because of this hope that these Jews are accusing me. In other words, he is saying because of everything that's in the Old Testament that points to Jesus Christ, that's why I'm being accused. And Agrippa and Festus should have just said, "Get out of here. This is crazy. Go take it up with your Jewish friends. It's just a difference in your religion. It's a difference in your view of things." But they couldn't do that because he was a Roman citizen who appealed to Caesar. Verse 8, "Why should any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead?" Well, if you were a Sadducee, you would say God doesn't raise the dead. If you're a Pharisee, you would say there are angels, there are spirits, there's an afterlife. People do raise from the dead. And a lot of people in our society today, if you said, there's an afterlife, that God raises us from the dead, there is a sense of being accountable in this life for the next life, well, they would look at you like you had 3 heads. Because there are many people in our society who believe this is it. You're on this horizontal plane, and when you die, that's it. There's nothing after that. But Paul didn't believe that. The Pharisees didn't believe that. Christians don't believe that. They believe that there is an afterlife. So he's saying to this politician, why is that abnormal? Why is that wacko? Why does that sound insane? And then he talks about his Acts 9 road to Damascus conversion in the next few verses. You can go back and read that for yourself in that chapter. He retells his conversion story about how on the road to Damascus. And then he adds this little thing in verse 13. "About noon, King Agrippa, I was on the road. I saw a light." And he says, I wasn't disobedient to the heavenly light. And he confronts Jesus on the road. So he's telling this story again. This is retold about 3 times in the book of Acts, from Acts chapter 9. And then he gives his rationale of why he speaks to Jews and Gentiles for Christ. And I just want to skip down. Verse 19, he says, "So then, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the vision from heaven," that road to Damascus experience. And then go down to where I have it highlighted. "I am saying nothing beyond what the prophets and Moses said would happen." Now the Jews standing there would be furious. Furious! because they're going to say, well, we're descendants of the prophets. We're descendants of Moses. We're descendants of Abraham. And this guy, even though he was a Pharisee, is claiming to be in that same lineage. Well, he was, and even more so, because Paul would go on to write that the person who is born a Jew is not really Jewish unless they are born again as a Jew, unless they know Christ as their Savior, unless they know the fulfillment of what God had promised to Moses and Abraham and the prophets and spoke through the prophets. And here's what they spoke, verse 23, that the Messiah would suffer and as the first to rise from the dead would bring the message of light to his own people and to the Gentiles. And that's where the rub is, because those Jewish people standing there at court would say, well, wait a minute, maybe he brought it to the Jews, but we're not the same as the Gentiles. The Gentiles were considered dogs. They were considered outcasts. The Jews wanted nothing to do with them. There was racism then. There was prejudice then between Jews and Gentiles. And when Paul says, and to the Gentiles also, saying they're equivalent, they're equal. Well, guess what? You're here because you were probably a Gentile who came to Christ, not a Jewish person. You may have some Jewish background, but guess what? What if this had won out, Paul had been killed, and it got snuffed out, and the only thing they had were, quote, Jewish Christians, and they didn't let Gentiles in? You and I wouldn't be here. All the great hospitals, all the great churches, all the great Christian movement in the United States would have never, ever happened because of this pivotal courtroom scene if it had gone the wrong way. Now, I love this. Festus has kind of had enough. He interrupts Paul, and then Paul makes some points. At this point, Festus interrupted Paul's defense. And you know what he says? You're nuts. You're out of your mind, Paul. And here's what he attributes it to. I gotta love this. Your great learning is driving you insane. Don't read any more books. Don't figure out anything else. Don't educate yourself anymore, Paul. Well, these were all pretty learned men anyway. But he's saying your great learning, all that stuff in the Old Testament, all the prophecy, is driving you insane. Paul said, I am not insane, most excellent Festus. What I am saying is true and reasonable. The king is familiar with these things. You know, what does he do? He goes from Festus to Agrippa, and he says, you know what? Agrippa, you're smarter than this. I don't want to call Festus a dummy, but you are smarter than this. It's a really good political move. The king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I am convinced that none of this has escaped his notice because it was not done in a corner. Do you ever learn that expression? You know, an event that was done in a corner, it was all covered up. Not this one. King Agrippa, here's his challenge. Do you believe the prophets? And then he says this, I know you do. I know you do. Well, I don't know if he did or not, but he was at least familiar with the Jews and the Old Testament and all of that. And then Agrippa said to Paul, do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to become a Christian? It's a challenge. What a statement to a leader, though. I mean, here's a king. Do you want to become a Christian? You know, what a great thing. Paul was always persistent. Paul replied, short time or long, I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains. Become a Christian, but not a chained up, imprisoned Christian like I am right now. The king arose, and with him the governor and Bernice and those sitting with them. And after they left the room, they began saying to one another, this man is not doing anything that deserves death or imprisonment. Agrippa said to Festus, This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. There's that Roman thing again. But God had a plan for him to go. So sometimes things don't work out in your life and in my life, right? But God's behind the scenes. He's controlling the strings. He's the one who's always making it, whether it's a health situation, a financial situation, whatever it is, that God will close doors and open doors to get you where He wants you to be and do what He wants you to do to serve Him, just like He did with the Apostle Paul. That has not changed. Now I'm going to ask you a question. What's the most important thing in life? It's not your health, it's not your money, it's not your credentials, it's not your education. It's where you keep your eye. That you keep your eye on Jesus Christ and His leadership.